1 Peter chapter 3, the inside cover of your bulletin has the passage. The essence of that passage says, set apart the Lord Jesus as Lord and be ready to give an answer or be ready to give a defense for the reason of the hope that lies within you. That we give an answer for the reason for our hope. The word that's translated reason or defense is a word that we get our word apologetics from. And so sometimes people hear that word apologetics and automatically they think, oh no, it's a big word, big term. That's not for me, that's for people who are apart from me. So let me introduce our setting this morning by letting you see a video by Vodi Bakum that he was offering in chapel at Dallas Theological Seminary.
The first objection that we have to apologetics is, we object on the grounds that we believe apologetics is for special forces Christians, right? It's for Navy SEAL, Green Beret, Marine Force Recon. It's Delta Force Christians. Those are the people who do apologetics. People who are well-versed in philosophy and in debate and, all these sorts of things and, world religions and this, that, and the other. And if we're honest, people who are just jerks. Can we just go ahead and tell the truth and shame the devil? We believe that, right? That you have to have kind of a little bit of an arrogant, nasty edge to you to even like apologetics, okay? This is what we believe. It's not for everybody. Well, Jude addresses that objection first. Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, to those who are called, beloved in God the Father, and kept for Jesus Christ. Now, here in verse 3, he's going to basically say to these individuals, I'm writing to encourage you to contend for the faith. So he's writing to encourage them to do apologetics. But notice to whom he's writing. Notice this Trinitarian address, called, beloved in God the Father, kept for Jesus Christ. You might as well go ahead and say, called by the Spirit, beloved by the Father, and kept by the Son, or for the Son. And then notice that followed by that sort of Trinitarian identification, there is this Trinitarian greeting. May mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you. Now, again, if we believe that apologetics, which is what we're being called to here in verse 3, is only for special forces Christians, then we would also have to agree that only special forces Christians are called by the Spirit, beloved by the Father, and kept for the Son. Well, we know that's not right. So we would have to then agree that we're wrong to think that this is a calling just for special forces Christians.
And so the purpose this morning is to say, no, it really is for all of us. So the instruction in 1 Peter chapter 3 is directed to us all in terms of being able to give an answer for our faith. And so what I did this morning is invite two nasty people, apparently, Doug and Polly, who aren't pastoral staff. They're just people who are part of the family of Faith Bible Church and people you're familiar with, who have an interest in apologetics. And then we have Mark, who does kind of fit that. Well, he's a pastor, but he's not nasty, okay? All right. So let me ask, as we start this morning, what is it how did you get interested and started with your interest in apologetics?
Well, it's clear to understand that there's just one nasty person. I got started in college. I grew up in a family where my parents were not believers, and so tried to understand some of the complexities of the faith, and then at Grace College took several classes on philosophical foundations, doctrine and apologetics. And then we started working with young adults. And if you're familiar with young adults, you're familiar with questions that they ask all the time. And so that kind of launched me into just the realm of apologetics and then just being fed over the last 30 years to continue to grow in that.
And I was kind of along for the ride with him as he, was going more that direction. I also was becoming more interested in things as I grew in the Lord, but also just my own background. I was raised in a church where it was not okay to ask those questions. They sounded blasphemous or heretical sometimes, and those just weren't allowed. And so I had my own questions that needed answering, and so that was kind of a natural flow. And then we have 4 children, 4 very different children, and each of them had different struggles through the years as well. So it was a personal journey, and then also a journey that flowed out into just the people that I love and care for.
Mark?
And I grew up more in a Christian bubble, if you will, and so going to Christian school throughout high school, and then going to a Christian college. But it really wasn't, and I took some classes on apologetics and loved learning about those things, sort of learning here are the 3 things you need to say about whatever topic it was. But then going to minister at Clemson to students and then ministering here, I've learned that's not sufficient. It's not just a memorizing of facts and trying to win an argument. But it is that there's something much more and much more spiritual warfare involved with dealing with these topics. So it's been given me a passion to think differently about apologetics.
We're using the idea of the justification of wisdom, because we've been looking at the subject of wisdom through the summer. Wisdom has to do with that Christian worldview. That there's a supernatural and a natural realm, and wisdom is that's reality, and learning how to live in the light of that reality, in harmony with that reality. But is there a justification for that worldview? Is there a justification for our faith? Paul talks about 1 Corinthians chapter 1, passage we were in last week, that the preaching of the gospel is foolishness to those who are unbelievers. He says, look, it may be foolishness to them, but he's not saying that the gospel is foolishness. He's not saying the gospel is not coherent, the gospel is not reasonable. We're not just dealing with a faith and fact over here. No, he says the gospel, the message, the word of wisdom is reasonable, it's defensible. It's not just a pie-in-the-sky faith. And so we want to make sure that we understand that, listen, there's good reasons why we believe what we believe in terms of that wisdom. That worldview idea, though, there's something that we need to realize about the times in which we live, as opposed to the times where some of us, like dating myself, the times where we grew up and have changed. So this is a clip from Timothy Keller from Redeemer in New York, and talking about the shifts, the cultural shifts, as we need to understand as Christians.
What are some of the challenges you see over the last decade?
Well, I just see exactly what Leslie Newbigin saw, and so this is nothing but, don't give me any credit for this at all. I'm just channeling him. He would say that for 1,000 years, the Western Church assumed a mission model in which most people in the culture would feel some social pressure, or at least see some social benefit to going to church.
Yeah.
And the culture created people that had the basic furniture for a Christian worldview. That is, they usually believed in a personal God. They often believed in an afterlife, heaven and hell. They believed that they should be good and they weren't perfect, and that therefore they did need forgiveness. So you could call those the religious dots. Mm-hmm. Belief in God, belief in an afterlife, belief in the moral law, belief in sin. And so the church could assume that people would just show up in church if they were invited, or they would show up in church maybe at Easter and Christmas, or maybe for weddings and funerals. And if they came, they would have a general respect for the Bible, and they would have some basic understanding of these things. And evangelism was just waiting for people to show up and then connecting the dots. But what do you do if people don't come to church, won't come to church, why should they, and don't have the dots? So you can't evangelize by saying, oh, you want to go to heaven when you die, right? And you know you're not perfect, but Jesus Christ died for your sins so that you can be sure, if you believe in him, that when you die you'll go to heaven. So that's assuming all the dots. And what if the dots aren't there? Now what do we do? And Newbigin's basically saying the entire Western Church for 1,000 years has assumed a Christendom culture, and now that it's gone, it has no way of reaching people, doesn't know how to talk to people, get their attention. It doesn't know how, even if they do show up, they don't know how to share the gospel in a way that makes sense to them. So is that a cause for concern? Yeah. Yeah. That's why I say that to me that is an overshadowing concern.
Yes, the dots aren't there anymore, or there aren't the hooks that you could hang things on anymore. We would have assumed that growing up in a Western culture that would have been there for you to engage people about the gospel and the truths of the gospel. And what he is saying is that those things aren't there anymore. So how do you go about that? Culture's changed, and thus the questions changed. That worldview has changed. And so let's just talk about worldview first, okay, in terms of observations about worldview, the change, and then how you might go about saying, what are the kinds of things that might be helpful for me or my kids in terms of shaping a Christian worldview?
I think some of the things that create a worldview fall into bucket areas that you've probably heard from somebody like Ravi or William Lane Craig or Frank Turek. They really address origin, where we came from, meaning, morality, and destiny. And then having that worldview be coherent and consistent. So it makes sense, and it's actually lived out in the world. And so to do that, you have to engage with the culture to a certain extent. So the question is, how much do we engage with the culture? Do we know what's happening in the culture? Do we listen to music? Do we watch movies? Do we engage with the issues? Do we know the meta-narrative, going from a modern society to possibly a postmodern, where things don't have clear definitions? That's going to equip you then to engage. I think the other thing that's important for us all to remember, too, is we share the gospel with people. We're asking them to fundamentally question their worldview. And they might ask you to fundamentally question your worldview. And your willingness to investigate with them is going to set the table for that discussion. And if you come off as, no, I'm good, I'm just working on you, then you're going to have a really difficult time getting them to engage, to verbalize their questions, to then answer the questions. And so part of that premise of worldview has to start with you, then move out into others in a culture. The other thing that I think we would want to recommend is don't confuse doctrinal issues with political or cultural issues. Jesus isn't concerned about capitalism. Okay? You might be, but he's not when it comes to apologetics. And so kind of look at it as a bank account. You only have so much to spend. And if you spend it on the Second Amendment or capitalism or other areas, you're using that collateral in an area that doesn't have anything to do with biblical doctrine. So try to make sure you're focused on that from a worldview perspective.
I love what Tim said about the furniture being changed, because it definitely has. The presuppositions within our culture are profoundly different. And we can no longer start with the Bible says this or the Bible says that, because that is not a starting place for most people. They don't see the scriptures as reliable or even relevant. And so are there other doors, though, that you can come through to address these issues? And there are many. There are many. If you train yourself and look for ways in conversation to get a door into spiritual issues for someone that you love or engaged with, there's many different ways to get there. We just can't use the same methodology that we used to. With atheism becoming way more rampant than it used to be, we can't really even jump to the gospel of Christ sometimes. We have to stay with more the meta-narrative picture of, is there a God at all? And be able to discuss on those terms, and the path is just a little different than it used to be.
And I think this is something that is a shift in how we go about sharing the gospel. We have to view ourselves not as the home team or on our home turf, but as the away team. And we're increasingly, our culture is less and less Christian as a whole. And I mean, you look from over the past 40 years and where churches have started to fade in some of their influence. And especially nominal Christianity, where it used to be a benefit to act as a Christian in our society. Now that's not the case. But I see that as a good thing in the sense that we get to shine in a different way and say that we're distinct. It's not that, well, yeah, the whole culture is Christian and we're just being a part of it, but no, this is going to be radically different. And when we approach apologetics, and I'm borrowing here from a couple different people, but we don't want to just go at it with well, this is what's true, here are the facts. But also, is Christianity beautiful? Does it tell a more compelling story? Does it have, are you personally captured by the beauty of God and what he has done? Because that will shine through. And then, is Christianity and the gospel good? Does it make you whole? Does your identity in Christ provide an answer to the questions that are being asked about loneliness, hopelessness, anxiousness that especially students, but people in general are struggling with?
Yeah, a couple of observations. One is that we talk about some of the needs, the question type things. You know, I grew up in a time with Josh McDowell, and you'd get evidence that demands a verdict, and you could just overwhelm people and just say, see, here's all the evidence, and here's the scientific facts and arguments. That's not necessarily where people are at today. They're not necessarily looking for the scientific arguments. They're more interested in some of the moral ideas, the moral type of questions. And that leads to this, is that the shift is from more rational idea to feeling or emotions. And so people are looking at what impacts their emotions now become more of the guide for discerning and determining what's true. And so very simply, you hear people say, it's not what do you think about this, it's how do you feel about this? And so that shift to now feelings, emotions now becoming, I think in the first I'll use the idea of a visceral response to things. It's very emotional and not necessarily looking at it from, wait a minute, just step back and let's think about what's reasonable and addressing some of these moral questions, okay, these types of questions that you listen to and then can probe and go a little bit further. So the questions are changing, and they deal more with the moral. This is a clip from a website called Capturing Christianity, and we'll give you that as a resource at the end. But the interview is interviewing a professor. His name is Jerry Walls, and he's talking about one of the biggies, one of the big questions, and that's the problem of evil. And so watch.
But here's something I always like to point out when I talk about the problem of evil. The very phrase, the problem of evil, is a loaded phrase. So here's something really worth thinking about. Why do we call it a problem? And why do we think there is such a thing as evil? What makes something evil, objectively speaking? And again, why is it a problem? One of the books that we read in my course on the problem of evil when I teach this course is a book by an atheist by the name of Susan Neiman, and it's a history of the modern problem of evil. And she makes this interesting observation. Every time we say, this ought not to have happened, we will put ourselves on the road to the problem of evil. Now here's the question that begs to be answered by all people. Why ought not terrible things to happen? Tell me why you think they shouldn't happen. And what I like to say, to put this most starkly, is thank God for the problem of evil. Thank God that I consider it a problem, and I've got a deep reason for calling it a problem. Look, it's a problem for everybody, in the sense that we often cope with it. It's a practical problem. But why shouldn't it happen if this world is a purely natural product of blind evolution? If it's a purely natural product, if ultimate reality is not good in some deep sense of the word, why shouldn't the laws of nature destroy lots of people? Why shouldn't people simply live by the survival of the fittest and the strong prey on the weak? Friedrich Nietzsche made the observation that strong people, these lofty birds of prey, they don't have the freedom not to prey on the lambs. That's just their nature. That's just the way they are. The strong will prey on the weak, and there's nothing can be done to change that fact. Now, I am grateful that I have a deep reason for believing that ultimate reality is good, that it ought not to be this way, that this is not the way God intended it to be, nor is it the way He's going to leave it forever, that God is setting it right, that He's revealed to us that the reason it's in this condition is because we've turned away from Him, broken His laws, and instead of loving each other as ourselves and as loving Him first and foremost, we've done exactly the opposite. And I have hope that this evil is going to be redeemed and it's going to be healed. So the Christian view of all views is the one that gives us a reason to say it ought not to be this way, and there's reason to hope that it won't always be this way. But if you're an atheist, why shouldn't it be this way? Why, in the name of God, ought not terrible things to happen if this world is simply a natural product, a product of totally naturalistic evolution? And again, the survival of the fittest, if that's the ultimate law, if that's what governs things. And we've got a universe that is expanding further and further apart, disintegrating. The suns are going to burn out, according to the naturalistic scientists, and it's going to be ever-expanding, disintegrating matter for endless eons. That's the end of the story. If that's where it's headed, if that's the story, evil is not a problem in the same way it is if you think ultimate reality is good, and especially if you think ultimate reality is not only good but powerful. It's precisely that conviction that gives us reason to believe evil is a problem and shouldn't be. It ought not to be this way.
Knowing what the question is, and lots of times responding not with what your propositional answers, but a lot of times asking questions back. See? His answer to that question, the problem of evil, do you see, he said, why ought it? Why is it a problem? So it's asking the questions. But the questions, ultimately, the questions that people ask, again, are moral, they seem to be. So what are some of the questions that you hear and you guys are dealing with and deal with young people or the people you interact with at work?
Evil is a huge one. It's definitely a door in to talking about worldview. And there are great resources, just too many to even talk about today. But I think we all have lists of people if you want to catch us after the service. But evil is a big door in. But if you're living, like he said, in a godless worldview, then the fact that you're troubled by evil, why is that? And asking those questions back. It could be social justice, it could be LGBT issues, it could be meaning and morality. Be careful not to answer the question of how to build a clock when they're just asking what time it is. So you do need to know the person that you're loving. You need to know kind of where their specialized, struggle point is. I think as the world has become more specialized, people have become more specialized. Our generation has a different set of questions than the generation that Mark is working with. So it's just knowing and loving people and not being so quick to speak. But, you have a worldview. Let's talk about inference to best explanation. What best explains the world the way we see it? Evil, suffering. Is it your worldview? Let's talk about that. It's a door into speaking about Christ and the gospel, for sure.
And I think Wayne brings up a really good point of blending your mind with your heart, right? Sometimes there's just a negative reaction. We've heard it before from friends we know that will talk about the problem of hell. And they're just upset that there's a place called hell. And you've got to let them voice that, listen to them, and then engage them. And so you saw it with the professor. He's obviously been affected by evil in his own life. And you saw it coming together in his answers. And so allow that to happen with people that you're engaging with. Some of the other questions that we've heard, just as a bullet point to read, is there only one true religion? Why does the Bible condone slavery? What about hell? What about the treatment of women in the Bible? The problem of evil, science versus religion, which one's true? Genocide in the Old Testament, why does God kill all groups of people? And then the Bible, its text. As Polly said, there's a lot of great resources and reference points here too. You know of one. Peter Gurry is starting to rise to the top with his book of Mistakes and Myths, where he's basically writing to Christians to be more accurate in how you state the biblical text and how we defend it. And so feel free to email the church, and we can suggest places to start if you know somebody who is Islamic and you want to try to share the gospel with them, or somebody who thinks that science is the answer to all of our questions. There's so many resources out there that you don't have to be the expert. I think that's what keeps most people away from apologetics, is that it's just hard to get started. They feel like they have to know everything before they even have the first conversation, and you don't have to.
I use the analogy of, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. So start with your bite and try not to be overwhelmed, and don't let fear overtake you.
And I think some of the questions that are bombarding students are more of on the social level of LGBTQ, what's going on with Black Lives Matter, what's going on in politics. There's those questions that they are wrestling through. They're swimming in that culture at school. And so they need to know how to live faithfully as Christians. So parents, the issues are different than when you went through school. So how you address it, I think, is really important to wrestle through it with them. Let them process and wrestle, instead of just saying, well, here's the conclusion. But wrestling with them to help them get to the biblical answer on it. And that takes a lot more time. I think another thing that our culture is asking, they're not asking about the truthfulness as much, because truth, what is truth? All truth claims. There's a distrust for that. I think what our culture is asking is, how can God be loving? How is he good? And I think people start to reject Christianity, not because they don't think it's true or untrue, but because they think it's oppressive or narrow-minded. And so, again, helping us tell the story of the Bible and how God is going to undo the curse. And he sees the suffering, and the suffering comes from sin, and he sent his son to redeem us from that. That's huge.
One of the very important realities that we give defense to apologetics is the truth of the resurrection. The Apostle Paul says, if there's no resurrection, then your faith's in vain. And so understanding the argument for the resurrection is very, very important. It ought to be important to us in our faith, is believing that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. And so the argument about the resurrection becomes a very key argument. When you start to talk to people, you can say to them, was there a person named Jesus? And inevitably, the answer to that is yes. Everybody believes that there was a historical person named Jesus. There's enough evidence for that. Jesus died? Yes. But when you point to the resurrection, now you open that door, because if there is a resurrection from the dead, now the question is, what difference does that make in not only how you live your life, but what is it that is impacting you, not only for this life, but maybe for the next life? What difference does it make that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead? The resurrection really is important. This is a clip from a gentleman, he's a professor at Liberty University. His name is Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas is one of the leading apologists on the subject of the resurrection, and has written numerous articles and books, and you can also see things online that Gary Habermas has done. Very, very helpful. But let's watch this one.
What is like your 5-minute spiel on the evidence in support of the resurrection? These are facts, these are historical facts, and this is what you specialize in. So
yeah, do less than 5 minutes. I start with what I call a minimal facts argument. It's a species of reliability, one of the reliability arguments, but where most reliability arguments are top-down arguments. If the book is reliable, it's like an umbrella. Everything under it gets kept, from the rain. If the book is generally true, whatever's reported under it is accurate. Mine's a bottom up, and instead of an umbrella, I would suggest an example of a brick wall with individual facts being bricks that we put together to build a case from the bottom up. And I've used anywhere from 3 to 7 over the years. Lately, I've been doing 6. And I would say, Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Because of their belief that he was raised, it is the event that has turned the world upside down religiously. In fact, a recent book on non-believing Jews and the resurrection, they even acknowledge, not being Christians, that Christianity is a resurrection religion. It was the resurrection that powered the religion, powered the teachings, even to the point of being willing to die. And we do have first century sources for arguably the 3 largest names in Christianity. 4, very important, it was proclaimed very early. And today, critics, the consensus position is that you can track the resurrection preaching back to immediately after the cross. In fact, the way it's often stated by, say, Bart Ehrman, is that when Paul said yes to Jesus on the way to Damascus, there was already a body of data called the early creeds that are later written in the New Testament, but they were already being noised abroad. When Paul said yes, there were these heavy creeds, about 80% of which are in the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, because that's a major message. They were already in existence. So when Paul didn't invent Christianity, the main reason, when he came to Christ, the message he hated most, we already have data from that 2-year period before Paul. And then the last 2 would be individuals, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, both of whom become Christians because they believed they had experiences which were appearances of the risen Jesus. Those are the 6 I would use. And to my knowledge, I've had dialogues with atheists, agnostics, scholars, specialists, and they don't dispute any of those.
So be students of the resurrection. But there's an even more powerful apologetic. Okay, and he mentioned it there. He looked at Paul, and he talked about James, the brother of Jesus. For the longest time, it's called a psychological argument, and that is that what is it that brings about a change in somebody? Figuring Paul was one of the greatest opponents, adversaries of Christianity. Paul was seeking to destroy Christianity. So everything about the Apostle Paul that we know was that this is a man who was dead set, zealously opposed to anything to do with the message of Jesus. He has an encounter on the road to Damascus, and he is dramatically transformed and changed. That there's this transformation of life from what he was to something new. That was true of James. I call this an incarnational apologetic. That is, how do you live out the reality of what you say you believe? What's that transformation? What's that change in your life? And so even the first Peter passage says, set apart Jesus as Lord. That brings about a transformation of life. And so that incarnational aspect now says one of the most powerful apologetics, defense of the gospel, is your life lived consistently with what you say you believe. And I think as parents, as dealing with students, would you say that that's one of the things that you hear most about in terms of the problems with people in Christianity?
I think at how it weaves together with apologetics, and where Wayne is right at the center of the issue, is that if you're not living out Christianity, it means you have questions. And typically we run from our own questions. And so you don't pray because you don't really think God's listening or there is one. And so I think it's a great starting point in your own personal life to understand your own apologetic journey, getting your own questions answered before you start answering others, because then it will reflect in your life. It just happens. What's interesting in that perspective too, when you think of the resurrection and Jesus, when you look at all the major religions, Christianity is wrapped up in a person. It's not wrapped up in teachings. It's not wrapped up in Buddha's teachings or Islam, Muhammad's teaching. It's wrapped up in him. And so he wants us to reflect him with how we live too. And so when you think of the resurrection and why it's so important, it's one of those fundamental principles that not just describes Christianity, but is Christianity, because it has to do with the person of Christ, and he wants us to live like that too. That then gets people's attention. I brought it up earlier in the first service. If you haven't seen the movie, I Can Only Imagine, you've probably heard the song. But the movie is so good because it talks about a man who was changed from being a monster to now somebody who was following Christ. And his son's only conclusion was, it's the power of the gospel. It has to be that. All the arguments were there, but it was his changed life that has had tectonic ripple effects in society. And so absolutely, we see that.
Yeah, this is a big one. Not only do we have enemies from the outside, but we kind of have this progressive Christianity, which is kind of an enemy from the inside, which is kind of gutting Christianity of its non-negotiables, the deity of Christ, the resurrection, justification by faith. And I wanted to get this in for those of you young parents as kind of a side resource, but Elisa Childers and her book, Mama Bear Apologetics, is worth looking up if you have young children, just to be prepared for not just the outside enemies, but the inside enemies, the progressive Christianity. But Elisa Childers was she was in a Christian group, Zoe Girl, years ago, and she had kind of her own crisis of faith, and she started basically getting into apologetics, and Mama Bear Apologetics. She was one of the authors. Hillary Fordman, I think, is the general editor, but for you young parents, definitely worth looking into, Mama Bear Apologetics. Ravi Zacharias, I think, was asked, and this is very sad, he says, what was your greatest doubt as this great apologist, and what brought you the greatest doubt? And he said that the transformed aren't more transformed. And that's heartbreaking. When we enter into a relationship with the Lord and the indwelling Holy Spirit, we're saying, I'm ready for the journey. I want to be changed. So daily, as you walk with the Lord, I don't know if this is individualistic American society, like I want to be who I want to be. I don't know what it is, but it fights against what we've entered into as believers. Change me, Lord, change me. I'm looking to be changed. He loves us as we are, but he loves us too much to leave us as we are. So be willing to be in that transformational process and make your life your greatest apologetic to the world.
I was reading an apologetics book recently by Josh Chatra called Telling a Better Story, and talking about some of these things that we've been mentioning this morning. But he says this, one important aspect of an apologetics tone that's often neglected is our communal apologetics as the church. So how we function together as a body of believers. The tone of our lives together as we serve others in word and deed. This is an apologetics that depends as much on being the right type of person as it does on having the right arguments. The goal is to embody the truth and beauty of the gospel, the ultimate aim of any truly Christian apologetics. And young people have a high hypocrisy meter, right? And so they will sense and see if this is something that you really believe, or you're just saying, well, this is what's true. Here are the facts. Let's all say yes to the same things. But are our lives transformed? I think that is so huge. And then just being humble ourselves and realizing that we do not have all the answers. It's fine to say, I don't know, or let's study this out together. And being willing to do the hard work to not just present the straw man argument and then knock it down, but really understand where someone's coming from, meet them where they're at, and wrestle through questions together. Something I give the students when we go through apologetics. We do it at least once every other year where there's an apologetics course that we're going through. I give them a list of 65 questions that every Christian needs to learn to answer. And I say, here's a list of questions. I want you to know that these questions exist, and look up 2 or 3 and really study through to wrestle through those things. I think that's crucial.
Yeah, one of the things in terms of this idea of incarnational, Jesus himself said, after talking about love one another, love one another, love one another, John 15, and then you get to John 17, and he says, look, in his prayer, in order that the world may know that the Father has sent me, it's demonstrated in your unity and basically your love for one another. That how we live together, how we demonstrate the reality of the love of God is a powerful testimony that speaks to the truth that the Father has sent the Son. And so this powerful testimony, witness that we give to the truth is our own life. One of the things that came up also in the first hour, and just make this clear, your arguments, your defense of Christianity is not what converts anybody. How smart you are in defending Christianity is not going to bring any conversion. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 says, I did not come to you with persuasive words of wisdom. It wasn't dependent on my ability to speak these words. We're just required to share. We share the truth, we share the scriptures, we share what we know. What we're doing is trusting in the power of the Spirit of God to change lives. It's the Spirit of God that convicts, it's the Spirit of God that converts. It's the Spirit of God that brings about that transformed life. And so it's not up to me to try to bring that into reality. That's what the Spirit of God does. And our job is to give a clear answer as best we can and trust the Spirit of God to do the work in their life. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The verse that helps me with that as well is 2 Timothy 2:24. It says, the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. So that's our responsibility. That's what we're called to teach and correct, but do it in a way that's not quarrelsome. And then this is what God says he will do. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth, that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. Because this is a spiritual battle that we're in. It's not just a battle of ideas, but we humbly proclaim truth, and God is the one who has to work in their hearts.
Any closing thoughts, guys?
What Mark brings up and Wayne have brought up about the spiritual dynamic aspect, and I know it's been part of the series, the reality of those two worlds. The struggle is not against flesh and blood. It truly, one of the questions that we probably hear the most, and it would make sense if the arch enemy of confusion is trying to derail people, is Christianity is too confusing. There's so many different denominations, there's so many different aspects of it. How can I ever get to the truth of it? And so helping people understand core, fundamental, and side issues, and we are so caught up in the side issues sometimes that we neglect the fundamental issues like his death, his burial, his resurrection. And so part of that in leading people is when we recognize as we're praying for them, we're not just, the apologetics isn't just, let me give you an argument and leave you alone. We love you. We care about you. That's what we're saying to them. So we're praying for them and asking the Lord to remove the blinders so the information can get through, so it can transform the heart, because he's the author of that. So,
probably as parents and grandparents, what I encourage you to do is your children at some point will be exposed to all these different ideas. And we talked in the first hour, I forgot to say it, just to live above the culture in a way that you're living watchfully and intentionally to see what the presuppositions and the furniture changes are going to be, because they're going to change again. And so we as God's people need to be watchful and living immersed in the culture, but not immersed in the culture. You know what I mean? We need to know what's out there, and you need to almost pre-expose your children before they get out there, because if you don't, and it comes to them as this wave, and so many are losing their faith when they get to the end of high school and early college, if you pre-expose them to some of these cultural ideas, they're going to be way better equipped, and the chances of them standing firm in what they believe and know are going to be greater. So just don't be afraid. It's so easy to be so, as a grandparent, I'm kind of freaked out over what's going on in the world, you know, and I have to continually remind myself, God is in control, He is sovereign, don't be fearful. He's equipped past generations when it probably looked dark to them as well, and He's going to equip you guys too. So, so pre-expose your kids, encourage you and your children to live above watchfully, not be so immersed that you don't see the changes and shifts coming and the changes in presuppositions. It's hard to do, but we've got to open our eyes to what's happening in the world and not be maybe overtaken by it. But
just one other quick thought on that dovetails on to Polly's comment. Tim Keller describes that as giving your kids antibodies. So exposing them to the issues gives them resistance. So when a smart skeptic comes along or their own crisis of faith, there's something there already. Where if you don't expose them to any of that, you're not preparing them. And so
go to some of those atheist websites and watch them with your kids. There are some smart atheists out there. Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor, he's one. He's kind of on the cutting edge right now. Just don't be afraid. Go out there. They're going to be exposed to it. So pre-expose them to it is my best advice.
Let me give you a couple of resources, okay? And by the way, I see people take their phones out and, okay, this will be up on the website tomorrow, okay? So you don't have to try to do that. We mentioned Capturing Christianity. It's a great resource. Cameron Bertuzzi does a number of interviews with people, and some of them that you mentioned. He's interviewing them, and if you got 50 minutes to an hour, sit down and watch. Very informative and engaging. And so that would be one. Ravi Zacharias Ministries, great resource again for things that you can get to, or lectures or presentations. And so that would be another one. Christian Mom Thoughts. Mark mentioned the 65 questions that he uses with the teens. That comes from that particular website. So if you go to Christian Mom Thoughts, and then search 65 questions, you'll get to that. Also, gutquestions.org, another one that's useful in terms of for young people. 2 books, or 3 books, Timothy Keller's little book, The Reason for God. I say it's little, it's really not a challenging read, but in the sense of difficulty, but one that you can use and you can share with somebody else, okay, who may have some questions, because it tries to address some of these new questions. Another one is Greg Kukl has a little book called Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. And in this, he talks about being like Columbo. So those of you who may remember Columbo, and it's Columbo in his little trench coat asking questions. This is just a great resource for figuring out how to ask questions. He talks about, look, you don't have to be a stumbling block. All you're looking to do is put a little stone in their shoe to get them to be thinking, reminding. And so this is just a great little resource called Tactics for sharing your faith, asking questions, and listening. Kukl has another one that I've used before, The Story of Reality, which is about the same size, but this deals with this idea of a Christian worldview. And it's very, again, simple to read. That gets you thinking along those lines of a Christian worldview. So those resources, and as Doug mentioned earlier, or Polly, if you have questions or you say, hey, are there other resources, email us here at church or contact Doug, Polly, and Mark. We'll try to get some of those resources to you to help you, okay? So that you're walking wisely in your sharing of the gospel, you're sharing your faith with people, and you know how to engage them, how to listen, and how to ask questions and give an answer for the hope that is within you.